close your eyes. Let everything that happened today settle down and away from you, like sediment drifting to the bottom of a still pool. The meetings, the errands, the noise, let all of it go. You have nothing to do and nowhere to be. The night is yours, and it is long and warm and full of rest. Take a slow breath in through your nose. Feel your chest rise, your belly expand. Hold it for just a moment, and then release it all. Every bit of tension you are carrying in your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. Do that again. Breathe in and let it go. Good. Tonight, I'm going to take you somewhere that most people alive today have never been able to imagine properly, because it was so unlike anything that has existed since. I am taking you to a mountain valley in the summer of 1830, to a week in July when the sky above Wyoming was so blue it seemed almost unreal, when the grass in the valley was waist-high and golden at the tips, and the air had that particular sharp sweetness of high-altitude summer mornings. I am taking you to the rendezvous. You may have heard that word before in the context of the American fur trade, this annual gathering of mountain men, trappers, indigenous traders, and supply caravans that took place for 15 years in the valleys of the Rocky Mountain West. But hearing about it and being there are different things. Tonight, we are going to be there. We are going to spend a week in that valley, in that time, moving through the days slowly and carefully, noticing everything. The smells and sounds and colors and textures, the extraordinary people and the extraordinary landscape, the facts and the details that make this brief, vanished world come alive. Let yourself drift toward that valley now. The words will carry you. There is no hurry, no destination to reach before sleep. Just the slow, easy unfolding of a week that happened almost 200 years ago, in a world that was extraordinary, and that is yours to inhabit tonight for as long as you like. The valley where the 1830 rendezvous is held is called the Wind River Valley, in the territory that will one day become the state of Wyoming. The Wind River rises in the mountains to the northwest, in the glaciers and snowfields of the Wind River Range, a chain of peaks that includes some of the highest mountains in the Rocky Mountain system, with summits reaching past 13,000 feet. By the time the river reaches this broad, grassy valley, it has gathered itself from dozens of tributaries and moves with the quiet confidence of a river that knows where it is going. The valley is roughly 10 miles wide and perhaps 30 miles long, oriented roughly northwest to southeast. The floor of the valley sits at about 5,000 feet above sea level, high enough that the air is noticeably thinner and crisper than at lower elevations, high enough that the nights are cold even in July, high enough that the sky seems closer and more present than it does at sea level. The mountains on both sides of the valley rise another 4,000 or 5,000 feet above the valley floor, their upper ridges still bearing the remnant snowfields of the previous winter, bright and white against the deep blue of the July sky. Grass in the valley bottom is extraordinary. The combination of snowmelt water from the surrounding mountains, deep alluvial soils built up over thousands of years of river flooding, and the intense summer sunlight at this altitude produces a growth of grass and wildflowers that rivals anything in the temperate world. In early July, the valley floor is a tapestry of green and gold and purple and white, big bluestem and Indian rice grass and wild rye swaying in the afternoon breeze, patches of lupine and Indian paintbrush, and the pale lavender of fleabane daisy scattered through the grass like brush strokes. It is into this valley, in the second week of July, that the rendezvous of 1830 is assembling. The supply caravan, organized this year by the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, which has taken over much of William Henry Ashley's original operation, has arrived from St. Louis after a journey of roughly 2 months and 1,000 miles. It consists of approximately 80 pack mules and horses loaded with the goods that the mountain men have been dreaming about through the long months of the trapping season: coffee and sugar and tobacco and flour, bolts of cloth and glass beads, and vermilion, gunpowder and lead, steel traps to replace those lost or broken. And as always, the whiskey, rough, dark, powerful whiskey, carried in wooden barrels strapped to the sides of the stoutest pack mules. From every direction, in ones and twos and small groups, the mountain men are converging on the valley. They have been traveling for days, some of them for weeks, from their winter and spring trapping grounds in the ranges to the north and west and south. They bring with them their horses and their packs of furs, their weapons and their dogs, and their wives, and in some cases their children. They bring stories of the year's trapping, of the country they have passed through, of the encounters, with animals, with weather, with hostile warriors, that have shaped the months since the last rendezvous. And from the east, moving downstream along the river and across the plains, come the indigenous delegations, Shoshone primarily, since this is their traditional territory, but also Crow and Flathead, and Bannock and Nez Perce, drawn by the trading opportunities and the social richness of the annual gathering. Let the valley settle into your mind now. Wide and green and golden, the mountains rising on both sides, the river winding through the middle, the sky enormous overhead. Let yourself feel the altitude, the thin, clean air, the particular quality of summer light at 5,000 feet. Rest here for a moment before the week begins. We will begin on Sunday, the 11th of July, 1830, which is the day that most of the major groups converge on the valley and the rendezvous properly begins. The morning is cold, perhaps 38 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, the grass white with a thin frost that will be gone within an hour of sunrise. The sky is cloudless, a deep dark blue that pales toward the east as the sun approaches. The river makes a sound like continuous, soft breathing. By mid-morning, the valley has been transformed. What was empty pasture 24 hours ago is now a city of canvas and hide. A sprawling, asymmetric settlement of perhaps 400 people, their tents and lean-tos and tipis spread across 2 miles of valley floor in loose clusters organized by group and affiliation. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company's supply camp is at the eastern end, its tents and supply wagons arranged in a rough square, with the company's factor, its business representative, already at work receiving trappers and recording the furs they are delivering. To the west of the supply camp, the mountain men's personal camps fill the valley in a patchwork of improvisation. Most of the trappers' shelters are simple, a canvas or buffalo hide lean-to rigged between 2 poles or stretched between 2 horses, sufficient to keep off rain and provide some privacy. A few men have small tipis acquired from indigenous friends or wives. Some sleep in the open, under the stars, which at this altitude and at this time of year are entirely adequate as a roof. Further west still, the indigenous camps are more substantial, full tipi villages, the conical forms rising in clusters along the riverbank, their smoke holes trailing thin lines of breakfast smoke into the morning air. The Shoshone camp is the largest, perhaps 150 people including women and children. They have been coming to this valley in summer since long before any Europeans set foot on this continent, and they move through the rendezvous with the comfortable authority of people on their own ground. The sounds of the gathering are extraordinary. The constant, overlapping noise of hundreds of people speaking in French, English, Spanish, Shoshone, Crow, and the fluid mixture of all of these that the frontier world had developed as its working tongue. Horses whinnying and the ring of their hobble chains. Dogs. There are dozens of them, of every conceivable mixed breed, barking and investigating each other with the intensity of dogs who have not met other dogs in months. Children running between the camps, the particular creak and thud of pack animals being unloaded, and underlying all of it, the constant sound of the Wind River flowing through the middle of the valley, cold and clear and indifferent to everything happening on its banks. The man whose experience we will follow through this week is named Nathaniel Drummond. He is 28 years old, originally from western Pennsylvania, and has been a mountain man for 5 years. He is lean and dark from the sun, with hands that have the particular texture of hands that have spent years in cold water and rough weather. He is not famous, he will not appear in the histories, but he is skilled and experienced and observant. And his rendezvous week is, in its ordinariness, representative of the experience of the majority of the men who attended these gatherings. Drummond arrives at the valley with 2 companions, a French-Canadian named Gaston, and an older man of mixed Crow and French heritage named Michel Trois-Rivières, who has been at the mountains for 15 years and who serves informally as guide and teacher to Drummond and Gaston. They bring 12 horses between them, 3 riding horses and 9 pack horses carrying the season's catch. The catch is good. Drummond helped trap 143 beaver plews over the course, of the spring season, along with 11 otter skins and a bundle of smaller furs. At current market rates, roughly $4 per prime beaver plume, his share of the catch should bring him somewhere around $200. This is real money by the standards of 1830, equivalent to several months' wages for a skilled laborer in the eastern cities. They set their camp near the river, in a spot that Michel selects with the practiced eye of someone who has been doing this for many years, sheltered from the prevailing west wind by a low ridge of river cobble, within easy walking distance of good water, and close enough to the main activity of the rendezvous to observe it, but far enough to have some quiet when they want it. As they unpack and make camp, Drummond looks around at the gathering valley and feels, as he always does at the beginning, of rendezvous, the complex mix of emotions that this place produces in him. Relief at having survived another year, pleasure at the prospect of company after months of near solitude, anticipation of the social richness of the days ahead, and, underneath everything, a faint, persistent awareness that this gathering is also the place where his year's earnings will disappear as inevitably as the morning frost disappears from the valley grass. Feel yourself settling into that camp now. The horses are hobbled. The fire is small and efficient, built in the way Michel has taught. A triangle of sticks over a handful of dry grass. The flames small and clean, no more wood than necessary. The coffee is boiling in the tin pot. The mountains rise around. The valley in the afternoon sun and the sounds of the rendezvous drift over on the breeze. Rest here. The week is just beginning. After making camp, the first business of any rendezvous was the delivering of the year's furs to the company's factor and receiving credit against which goods could be drawn. This was not a simple or quick process, and it occupied much of the first day and a half for most of the trappers arriving at the 1830 gathering. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company was one of several competing enterprises operating in the mountain fur trade in 1830. Its principal partners included Thomas Fitzpatrick, Milton Sublette, Henry Frabe, Jean-Baptiste Gervais, and Henry Frabe, all experienced mountain men themselves, which gave the company a character somewhat different from the more purely commercial enterprises that preceded it. These men understood the trapper's world from the inside, having lived it, and this understanding shaped the way they ran their operation. The formal business of delivering furs involved a process that Drummond and most experienced mountain men knew well and accepted with a certain philosophical resignation. Each trapper's furs were examined and graded by the company's factor. A man named Robert Campbell, in the 1830 season, a Scots-Irish businessman from Virginia who was new to the mountains but efficient and fair in his dealings. The grading system divided beaver pelts into 3 categories: plus or prime for the finest pelts with the thickest, most intact underfur; seconds for good but slightly inferior pelts; and refuse for damaged or thin pelts that would bring a substantially lower price. Drummond's pelts are graded carefully, each one unrolled from its flat-dried form, examined front and back, and assessed. Of his 143 beaver plumes, Campbell grades 107 as prime, 31 as seconds, and 5 as refuse. The otter skins are graded separately. Otter was a highly valued fur in the China trade, where the silky, dark brown skins commanded extraordinary prices in the luxury markets of Canton and Beijing, and all 11 of Drummond's are graded as prime. The total value of Drummond's catch, calculated at the company's official rates, comes to $214.50. This figure is entered in the company's ledger against his name. Against this credit, Drummond must purchase everything he needs for the coming year. The list is not short. He needs gunpowder. He has used approximately 12 pounds in the past year and will need at least that amount for the next. He needs lead for making his own bullets, cast in the small iron mold he carries in his kit. He needs a new No. 4 beaver trap to replace one that was sprung by a beaver large enough to drag it into deep water and lose it. He needs coffee. He has been thinking about coffee since April. He needs tobacco. He needs a new woolen blanket, since his current one has developed a hole that the mice of his winter camp enlarged beyond reasonable repair. He does not write this list down. Drummond, like most mountain men of his era, is only marginally literate, his reading and writing limited to the basics needed for commercial transactions. He carries the list in his head, rehearsed through weeks of travel, and he delivers it to Campbell with a precision that surprises the factor, who is accustomed to the careful record-keeping of the commercial world. The prices Campbell charges for these goods are eye-opening, as they always are. Gunpowder, which costs perhaps 60 cents a pound in St. Louis, is charged at $2 a pound at Rendezvous. Coffee, which costs 12 cents a pound in a St. Louis grocery, is charged at $1.50. The new beaver trap, which costs $2 in the city, is $5 here. The blanket, a good 3-point Hudson's Bay, worth perhaps $2.50 at retail, costs $6 at Rendezvous. These markups reflect the real cost of the supply caravan. The 100 mules, the drivers, the guards, the food for the journey, the risk of the 1,000-mile trip through uncertain weather and potentially hostile country. The trappers knew this, and most of them accepted the markups as the price of doing business in the mountains. What they did not always accept gracefully was the whiskey pricing. Whiskey at Rendezvous was sold by the pint at prices that were truly extraordinary. Sometimes as much as $1 a pint for a liquid that had cost perhaps 5 cents to produce in the distilleries of Pennsylvania or Kentucky. The whiskey was also typically adulterated, diluted with water, flavored with tobacco or red pepper to give it apparent potency, sometimes treated with molasses to give it color. The mountain men knew it was inferior, they bought it anyway. The social logic of the Rendezvous and the genuine intensity of their desire for alcohol after months of abstinence made the arithmetic of the transaction irrelevant. Drummond is aware of this arithmetic. Michelle has explained it to him, calmly, and without judgment, every year he has been in the mountains. He nods, accepts the credit balance after his purchases, $112, which will decrease further before the week is out, and goes back to his camp with his goods. Let the numbers drift away now. The accounting is done. The goods are stowed. The evening is coming on and the valley is filling with firelight, dozens of small fires appearing across the grass like earthbound stars. Let your body relax completely into the warmth around you. Sunday evening, as the valley settles into its first night as a rendezvous camp, the fires multiply across the grass like an earthbound constellation. Small fires mostly, since wood is not unlimited and experienced outdoors people do not waste fuel. But there are enough of them to create, from the ridge above the camp, a sight that Drummond will remember for the rest of his life. The valley floor pricked with orange light, the river a dark, winding line through the middle, the mountains black and enormous overhead, and the sky above everything blazing with stars. The first evening of Rendezvous has a particular quality that the later evenings, for all their energy, cannot quite replicate. It is the evening of reunion, of men who have spent months in near isolation, discovering that the people they have been thinking about are alive and well and present. Every handshake and embrace and shouted name represents a small private calculation completed. He made it, she made it, they made it through another year. Drummond spends the early part of the evening moving through the camp, doing this calculation over and over. Old friends from his first year in the mountains, acquaintances made at previous rendezvous who have become something more than acquaintances over the years. A man named Beckworth, James Beckworth, whom Drummond knows only slightly but who is impossible to miss in any gathering because of his physical presence and his extraordinary personal history. James Pearson Beckworth was born in 1798, the son of a white Virginia planter and a woman who was either enslaved or of mixed heritage. The historical record is not entirely clear on this point. He came west in his 20s, working first as a blacksmith in St. Louis and then as a trapper and scout for the fur trade companies. By 1824, he was in the mountains. By 1828, he had, for reasons that combined genuine attraction and practical strategy, integrated himself into the Crow Nation to such a degree that he was adopted as a Crow warrior and given a Crow name, Morning Star, and lived among the Crow for several years as one of their own. Beckworth's position was unusual but not unique. The frontier world contained many people of mixed heritage and complicated allegiances who moved between the European-American and indigenous worlds with varying degrees of ease. What made Beckworth notable was the combination of his African-American heritage, his mountain man skills, his Crow adoption, and his later extraordinary career as a scout, explorer, and eventual discoverer of the mountain pass through the Sierra Nevada that bears his name, Beckworth Pass, at an elevation of about 5,200 feet, the lowest of the Trans-Sierra routes. He is, at this rendezvous, 32 years old and already famous in the mountain man world for his physical courage, his hunting skill, and his talent for survival in situations that killed other men. He is also famous for his storytelling. His accounts of his own adventures tend, as his later published memoir would confirm, toward the enthusiastically embellished, and sorting the truth from the enhancement is a project that historians have been engaged in ever since. Drummond watches him from a respectful distance at the evening fire and thinks that the mountain man world he has entered contains people more various and more extraordinary than anything he could have imagined. In Pennsylvania, the fires burn low, the valley settles. The week is beginning. Let the evening be warm and full around you. The fires, the voices, the stars appearing one by one above the mountains. The particular relief of reunion. Let it all settle into the comfortable background of a summer evening, and let your eyes close. Monday afternoon, Drummond spends an hour talking with Robert Campbell, the factor, not about business, the business is done, but about St. Louis, which Campbell left 8 weeks ago and which represents for both men the point where the mountain world connects to the larger world. St. Louis in 1830 is a city of approximately 5,000 people, situated at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, at what was at the time the functional western edge of American settlement. It is not a beautiful city. The contemporary accounts describe it as rough and commercial, its streets muddy, its riverfront crowded with boats and goods, and the particular disorder of a trading center that has grown faster than its infrastructure. But it is one of the most important cities in America, because it sits at the convergence of the two greatest river systems of the continent, and everything that moves between the settled East and the Wild West passes through it. The goods that the supply caravan has brought to the 1830 rendezvous represent the product of a supply chain that extends from St. Louis outward in every direction to the manufacturing centers of the world. Let us trace it carefully, because the detail is genuinely extraordinary. The gunpowder came from mills in Delaware, specifically from the mills along Brandywine Creek that had been established by the DuPont family in 1802. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, a French-born chemist who had trained under Antoine Lavoisier, one of the founders of modern chemistry, came to America and recognized that the American gunpowder industry was inferior to the European. He built his mills using the best available French technology, and within a decade, E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company was supplying gunpowder to the American Army, the American Navy, and one through the commercial channels that led to the St. Louis trading companies, to the mountain men of the Rocky Mountain West. The company DuPont, founded in 1802, still exists, though it no longer makes gunpowder. The blankets came from the same mills in Whitney, Oxfordshire, that had been supplying the Hudson's Bay Company since the 17th century. The town of Whitney had been a centre of wool weaving since the 13th century, when the wool trade of the English Cotswolds was one of the foundations of the English economy. The weavers of Whitney had, by 1830, been making trade blankets for the North American fur trade for more than a century, and their product was of a consistency and quality that was recognized and trusted by indigenous traders from Hudson Bay to the Wind River Valley. The coffee, Drummond's coffee, which he is consuming with such devotion, came from Brazil, where the coffee industry had been growing since the early 18th century and would, by the mid-19th century, make Brazil the world's largest coffee producer. The Brazilian coffee was shipped to New Orleans, the great commercial port of the American South, and from there upriver to St. Louis, and from St. Louis upriver to the jumping-off point of the supply caravan, and across 1,000 miles of prairie and mountain country to this valley. The journey of a single pound of coffee, from the highland plantation in Minas Gerais or São Paulo, where the beans were grown, to the cup in Drummond's hand, involved perhaps 8 separate handlings, 2 ocean crossings, and a land journey of more than 1,000 miles. The cost at each stage was modest, but by the time it reached the rendezvous, it had accumulated enough markup to be worth perhaps 30 times its original farm gate price. This supply chain, global, complex, connecting the mountain wilderness to the manufacturing centers of Europe and the agricultural regions of South America, is one of the remarkable things about the rendezvous economy. The mountain men who attended these gatherings were not isolated from the global economy. They were, in a very real sense, its western edge. The last link in supply chains that stretched across oceans and continents, and the first link in commercial chains that sent the products of the Rocky Mountain wilderness back to the hat shops of London and the counting houses of Canton. Rest in this knowledge. The world has always been more connected than it seems. The coffee in your hands, the blanket around your shoulders, the steel in your knife, all of them have traveled further than you think. Monday morning at the 1830 rendezvous, dawn's cold and clear again, the frost a little heavier than the day before, the sky above the eastern mountains turning from grey to gold to brilliant blue in the space of 20 minutes as the sun clears the ridge. Drummond wakes before the others, as is his habit in the mountains. The silence of the very early morning at rendezvous is a particular kind of silence. Not the absolute silence of a solo camp in the deep wilderness, but a human silence, the breathing and shifting of hundreds of sleeping people, the occasional sound of a horse or a dog, the river beneath it all. He lies in his blankets for a few minutes, looking up at the sky, which is still dark enough to hold a few bright stars near the western horizon. He thinks about the geography of the place, something he does habitually, having learned from Michel that a careful man always understands the land around him. The Wind River Valley is part of a larger system of basins and ranges that characterizes the central Rocky Mountain region. To the northwest, the Wind River Range rises in a dramatic wall of granite and glacial ice. To the southeast, the valley opens toward the Wyoming Basin, a high, arid plateau that forms one of the few genuinely flat crossings of the Rocky Mountain chain, and that the mountain men had learned was the most practical route for wagon travel. Between the eastern prairies and the Pacific drainage, this crossing, which would eventually become known as South Pass, had been identified by mountain men in the early 1820s and was already being used regularly by the supply caravans to the rendezvous. It sat at approximately 7,500 feet above sea level, which was lower than most mountain passes, and it was so gradual in its ascent and descent that a loaded wagon could cross it without undue difficulty. This would prove to be one of the most consequential geographical facts in the history of the American West. South Pass would become the gateway through which the Oregon Trail carried its hundreds of thousands of emigrant settlers to the Pacific coast in the 1840s and 1850s. But in 1830, only the mountain men and the supply caravans knew about it. After breakfast, coffee boiled thick and strong in the tin pot, a handful of dried venison chewed while standing by the fire, Drummond makes his way through the rendezvous camp, observing and taking stock. The camp by Monday morning is more settled than it was on arrival day. The various groups have organized themselves into their particular corners of the valley, and the social geography of the gathering has become readable to someone who knows how to read it. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company's supply depot is the commercial center of the gathering. Around it, the trappers who work most closely with the company have clustered their camps. These are the hired men, the engagés, who work on salary rather than on the free agent, independent basis of men like Drummond. They are typically younger and less experienced than the free trappers, bound by contract for a year or more to the company's service. Further from the supply depot, the free trappers have spread out in patterns that reflect their personal alliances and friendships. The American-born trappers tend to cluster together, as do the French Canadians, though these groupings are not rigid. Friendships formed over years of shared danger cross any national line. The most experienced men, like Michel, tend to camp at the edges of the gathering, where they can observe everything while maintaining some distance from the noise at the center. The indigenous camps are arranged according to their own protocols. The Shoshone, as the home nation in this territory, occupy the choicest positions along the river. Their chief, a man the mountain men call Mountain Goat for his sure-footedness, in the rocky country above the valley, has positioned his people's camp so that all traffic between the eastern and western parts of the rendezvous passes near it, a position that gives the Shoshone both visibility and access, two things that experienced traders always seek. Walk through the camp with Drummond now, slowly taking in the details. the sound of many languages, the smell of many fires, the color of the morning light on the mountains to the west, still casting long shadows down the valley floor. The horses everywhere, hobbled or on picket lines, their ears moving independently as they track the sounds of the camp. Let all of it wash over you softly, without urgency. By mid-morning on Monday, a shooting competition has organized itself in the north end of the valley, in the way that such things always organized themselves at Rendezvous. Without formal announcement or official organization, simply by the gravitational pull of competition and the desire to show off skills that had been maintained at great cost through the long months of the wilderness. Drummond joins the crowd that has gathered around the shooting ground and watches for a while before entering the competition himself. The targets are paper cards, the face cards from a deck of playing cards, tacked to a wooden board at a distance that will be measured at the end of the competition to confirm the shooter's claim of range. The standard target distance for a serious shooting competition at Rendezvous was 200 yards, which is a genuinely impressive range for a flintlock or percussion cap rifle of the 1830s. The rifle that most of the serious competitors are shooting is the Hawken, and it is worth pausing here to appreciate this extraordinary instrument, because the Hawken rifle was as perfectly adapted to its environment as any tool that human beings have ever made. The Hawken was made by brothers Jacob and Samuel Hawken at their gunsmith shop at 34 North Main Street in St. Louis, Missouri, a shop that Jacob established in 1815 and that Samuel joined around 1820. The brothers were German immigrants who had trained in the gunsmithing traditions of Pennsylvania and brought to the frontier a combination of craftsmanship and practical ingenuity that produced, over the course of their careers, what most historians and firearms experts consider the finest working rifle ever designed for the American wilderness. The Hawken departed from the long, elegant lines of the earlier Kentucky rifle. The long-barreled, small-caliber rifle of the eastern frontier, in several important ways. The Hawken barrel was shorter, typically between 32 and 36 inches, compared to the 40 to 48-inch barrels of the Kentucky rifles. This shorter barrel made the Hawken more manageable on horseback and in the dense undergrowth of mountain country. The caliber was substantially larger, typically between 50 and 58 caliber, compared to the 36 to 45 caliber of the Kentucky rifles. This larger caliber was necessary for reliable killing power against the large game of the West: elk, bison, grizzly bear. The Hawken's stock was made of maple, specifically the figured maple that the brothers preferred for its combination of beauty and strength. The stock was shorter and more steeply curved than the Pennsylvania rifles, designed for the robust close-quarters shooting that the mountain environment demanded. The lock, the mechanism that fired the rifle, was the best available, precisely fitted to minimize the fraction of a second delay between the trigger pull and the ignition that could mean the difference between a clean kill and a wounded, dangerous animal. By 1830, the Hawken was available in both flintlock and percussion cap versions. The percussion cap, a small copper cap containing a sensitive explosive compound placed over a nipple on the rifle's breech, had been invented in the 1810s and was gradually replacing the older flintlock mechanism, which required fine-grained priming powder in a small pan beside the barrel and was sensitive to wind and moisture. The percussion cap was simpler, more reliable, and faster to operate, and by the early 1830s, experienced mountain men were converting their flintlock Hawkens to percussion whenever they could. The price of a Hawken rifle in 1830 was approximately $30 for a standard model, a significant sum equivalent to several weeks' wages for an Eastern factory worker. At Rendezvous, where everything was priced at a premium, a new Hawken might cost $50 or more. Most mountain men who owned Hawkens had purchased them in St. Louis before heading to the mountains and treated them with a care bordering on reverence. In the shooting competition, the man who wins, and this is not a fictional detail, as shooting competitions at Rendezvous were well documented by contemporary observers, is a trapper from Virginia named Thomas who drives his ball through the exact center of a king of hearts at 220 measured yards. He does this 3 times in succession, reloading between each shot with a speed and economy of motion that draws appreciative murmurs from the crowd. His rifle is a Hawken of the percussion cap type, and he accepts the congratulations of his competitors with the same quiet efficiency with which he loaded and fired. Drummond shoots well, but not brilliantly in the competition. He hits his target twice in 3 attempts at 200 yards, which is respectable, but not winning. He watches Thomas shoot the 3rd time and then turns back toward the main camp, satisfied with the morning's entertainment. Let the image of the shooter form in your mind, the particular stillness of a person at the moment of complete focus, the world narrowed to the sight picture and the distant target, the slow squeeze of the trigger, the puff of smoke, the distant punch of a ball through a paper card. Then let it dissolve, softly, and let your mind rest. Monday afternoon, Drummond sits with Michelle near the edge of the Shoshone camp, at the invitation of a Shoshone man named Two Hawks, with whom Michelle has traded for several years. They drink tea. The Shoshone have acquired a taste for the black tea that the supply caravans bring, and Two Hawks keeps a small tin of it for occasions of hospitality, and talk through Michelle's interpretation about the season, the country, and the news that each party brings from their respective territories. The Shoshone people, also called the snake, from the hand sign used to represent them in plain sign language, a sinuous motion of the hand at waist height, are one of the most geographically dispersed of the Great Basin and mountain peoples. At the time of the 1830 rendezvous, the various bands of Shoshone ranged across an enormous territory stretching from the Snake River Plateau in what is now Idaho south through the Great Basin of Nevada and Utah, east to the Wind River and Bighorn, country of Wyoming. The eastern Shoshone, the people of the Wind River country, had acquired horses sometime in the early 18th century, obtained through trade from the Ute people of the south, who had in turn obtained them from the Spanish settlements of New Mexico. The horse transformed the eastern Shoshone in ways that were profound and rapid. They became equestrian hunters, following the bison herds across the high plains and mountain meadows, and their social organization, material culture, and territory expanded dramatically with the mobility that horses provided. Two Hawks is a man of about 45, with a wide, weather-beaten face and the deliberate manner of someone accustomed to being listened to. He is not the chief of his band, but he is a man of considerable standing, known as a skilled hunter, a reliable trader, and a person whose word, once given, is kept. He and Michelle have a friendship that has been built over many rendezvous and many trading sessions, a friendship built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that both men are skilled at what they do. He tells Michelle about the winter, which was hard. The snow came early and stayed late in the Wind River country, and the bison was scarce on the usual ranges, having moved further south than usual. Two Hawks' band spent a difficult February in a sheltered canyon, subsisting on stored dried meat and what they could hunt in the surrounding hills. 3 elderly members of the band died during those weeks, not of starvation, but of the cold and of ailments that the cold exacerbated. He also reports something that Drummond and Michelle find more troubling: increasing Blackfoot presence to the north. The Blackfoot, the confederacy of 3 related nations, the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani, had long been the most aggressive adversaries of the American trappers in the northern Rockies, and they were also in periodic conflict with the Shoshone along the contested border territories between their respective ranges. Two Hawks describes a raid in late April in which a Blackfoot war party had attacked a small Shoshone camp near the Yellowstone country, killing 2 young men and taking 6 horses. This information is received seriously by both Michelle and Drummond. The location of the Blackfoot and the state of their relations with both the mountain men and their Shoshone allies was practical, potentially life-saving intelligence. Drummond will carry this information when he leaves the rendezvous and heads north toward his fall trapping grounds. The conversation turns to lighter things. Two Hawks asks about the supply caravan. What goods have they brought? What are the prices? Are the blankets good quality this year, or has the company cut corners as they sometimes do? Michelle reports honestly, and Two Hawks nods with the satisfaction of a man whose intelligence network is working correctly. He already knew much of this, of course. The Shoshone had scouts watching the supply caravans approach for days before it arrived. Let the tea be warm in your hands. The afternoon light falls golden across the Shoshone camp. and the sound of children somewhere nearby is a comfortable background presence. The mountains are perfect and still above the valley. Rest here. Tuesday begins with a morning of commerce. That would look familiar, in its essentials, to anyone who has ever attended a large outdoor market, though the goods on offer and the currency used were unlike anything available at any market anywhere else on Earth. The trading that took place at Rendezvous operated on two distinct levels. There was the formal trading with the fur company, the exchange of furs for goods at the official exchange rates conducted at the company's supply depot, and there was the informal, person-to-person trading that happened throughout the Veit gathering with no official oversight and no fixed prices. This informal economy was, in many ways, more interesting than the formal one. Mountain men traded with each other constantly, swapping equipment, food, clothing, horses, and services in a market where the prices were set entirely by negotiation and the skills of the individual traders. A man who had brought an excess of coffee could trade some of it for tobacco. A man with a fine horse and no immediate need for it could trade it for a season's supply of gunpowder. A man with a skill, a blacksmith's knowledge or a talent for making moccasins, or the ability to perform minor surgery, could trade that skill for goods or credit. The informal economy also extended to the indigenous participants. The Shoshone brought to the rendezvous goods that the mountain men genuinely needed and could not easily obtain through the supply caravan. Horses, particularly the fine, well-trained horses for which the eastern Shoshone were known. Dried meat and pemmican, which was a more reliable food source than anything the supply caravan carried. Tanned hides and finished clothing, moccasins, leggings, shirts, made with the skilled handworking techniques that the Shoshone women had perfected over generations. And geographical knowledge, the kind of intimate, detailed understanding of the surrounding country that was worth more than any material goods to a trapper preparing for a season in unfamiliar territory. Drummond spends Tuesday morning engaged in this informal market with energy and focus. He has identified several things he wants or needs that the company's supply depot either doesn't carry or prices too high, and he moves through the camp with the purposeful air of a man who has a shopping list but is enjoying the process. He trades a portion of his excess lead, he bought more than he strictly needs, to a French-Canadian trapper named Bouchard for 6 pounds of good dried buffalo meat, which will feed him and his companions for several days without requiring them to hunt. He trades 2 small otter skins, ones he held back from the company's factor because he suspected he could get better value for them in the informal market, to a Shoshone woman for a pair of moccasins that fit him better than anything he could have described to a shoemaker. These moccasins deserve a moment of attention because they represent a piece of technology that was perfectly adapted to its environment in a way that the manufactured boots and shoes of the Eastern world simply were not. The traditional Shoshone moccasin of the mountain and plains regions was a 2-piece construction. A thick, hard-soled bottom of rawhide, untanned, stiff hide that resisted puncture from sharp rocks and thorns, and a soft upper of brain-tanned buckskin that was worked to extraordinary softness and suppleness. The 2 pieces were sewn together with a sinew thread, which was stronger than any thread available from a commercial manufacturer, and which, when wet, swelled and tightened, making the seam more waterproof rather than less. The fit was achieved by a technique that no commercial shoemaker had replicated. The moccasin was cut and sewn to match the wearer's actual foot, which was traced on the hide before cutting. The resulting fit was individual, precise, and comfortable in a way that no mass-produced shoe could achieve. Mountain men who wore moccasins regularly, and most of them did after sufficient experience, uniformly reported that they were more comfortable, more practical, and more durable than any alternative for the kind of travel and work that mountain life required. Let the moccasins on your feet be soft and perfect. Let your weight settle evenly. The morning is warm and busy around you. The sound of commerce, the particular murmur of negotiation and transaction, fills the valley. And through all of it, the river runs its steady, unhurried course. Rest. Before the morning trading begins in earnest, Drummond accepts an invitation from 2 hawks to come inside his family's tipi for morning tea. an invitation that is partly hospitality and partly, Drummond suspects, an opportunity for Two Hawks to conduct his own assessment of the American trapper's character and worth. The tipi in which Two Hawks and his family live during the rendezvous is a large one, perhaps 18 feet in diameter at the base, supported by 17 lodge poles of peeled lodgepole pine, each one about 20 feet long. The cover is made of 14 dressed bison hides, sewn together by Painted Wing and two of her friends over the course of a spring week several years ago, and it has been repaired and maintained since with the careful attention of someone who understands the importance of a good shelter in the mountain climate. The engineering of the tipi is one of the genuine masterpieces of practical architecture, and Drummond, who has slept in tipis several times and who has tried, unsuccessfully, to construct one himself, has a deep appreciation for what he is sitting inside. The basic challenge of the tipi is this. You need a shelter that is warm in winter, reasonably cool in summer, weatherproof in rain, stable in high wind, and that can be set up and taken down by two people in 20 minutes. These requirements seem nearly contradictory. Structures that are warm tend to be heavy and difficult to move. Structures that are light and portable tend to be cold and fragile. The tipi solves this contradiction with a series of elegant design choices that took many generations of experimentation and refinement to perfect. The conical shape is the first key. A cone sheds rain and snow naturally, with no flat surfaces, to collect water, and it distributes wind load evenly around the structure rather than presenting a single face to the wind. The poles that form the cone extend above the cover at the top, and the gap between them is adjusted by a pair of ear-shaped flaps, the smoke flap, that can be angled to create a draft that draws smoke from the interior fire upward and out, regardless of which direction the wind is blowing. Getting this smoke flap adjustment right is a skill that takes practice, and a properly adjusted tipi draws like a well-designed fireplace. The cover is staked to the ground around the perimeter, but the connection between cover and ground is not rigid. It is adjustable. In warm weather, the lower edge of the cover can be raised and rolled up to allow ventilation. In cold weather, it is staked tight and augmented by a liner, a smaller inner wall of hides that creates an insulating air gap between the inner and outer surfaces and channels cold air from the ground upward and out the smoke hole rather than into the living space. The result is a structure that maintains a comfortable interior temperature with a surprisingly small fire, sheds wind and rain with a reliability that wooden buildings sometimes fail to match, and can be transported by a family with horses in the time it takes the next day's camp to be selected. No architect working in the formal tradition of the Western world designed anything better adapted to its purpose until the development of modern lightweight expedition tents in the 20th century, and even those, for all their technical refinement, do not surpass the tipi in the specific conditions of the northern plains and mountain climate. Drummond sits cross-legged on a buffalo robe inside Two Hawks' tipi and drinks his tea and listens to the sounds of the camp outside, muffled to a comfortable murmur by the thickness of the hide walls, and thinks, not for the first time, that the Shoshone know things that the Eastern world with all its books and buildings has not figured out yet. Let the tipi surround you now. The warmth of the small fire in the center, the curved walls catching the light and reflecting it softly, the smell of hides and smoke and tea, the sound of the camp outside distant and gentle. You are sitting exactly where you are meant to sit. Everything is as it should be. Coffee is an ancient drink. The Coffea arabica plant, the species that produces the beans used in most commercial coffee, is native to the highlands of Ethiopia, where it was likely being consumed as early as the 9th century, perhaps earlier. From Ethiopia, coffee spread to Yemen, where it was being cultivated commercially by the 15th century, and from Yemen to the wider Islamic world, where coffee houses, the world's first places whose primary purpose was the consumption and discussion over a hot beverage, had been established in cities from Cairo to Istanbul by the mid-16th century. Coffee arrived in Europe in the 17th century and spread rapidly, displacing beer and wine as the primary daytime beverage of the professional and merchant classes. The coffee houses of London, there were at one point more than 2,000 of them in the city, were the social and commercial hubs where news was exchanged, business was conducted, and the culture of what would eventually become modern commerce was being formed. Lloyd's of London, the famous insurance market, began as a coffee house. The New York Stock Exchange evolved from merchants meeting in a coffee house. The coffee that Drummond brews in his tin pot has none of the refinement of a London coffee house. It is boiled rather than steeped, a method that produces a strong, slightly bitter, somewhat muddy brew that is nothing like the clear, delicate coffee of proper brewing. A pinch of salt is added to cut the bitterness, a technique adopted from indigenous cooking practices. The result is drunk from a tin cup that holds the heat well enough that the coffee stays warm for perhaps 10 minutes in the afternoon air. It is, Drummond thinks, the best thing he has tasted since last year's rendezvous. Michel sits across the fire from him, drinking his own coffee with the meditative air that he brings to most pleasurable experiences. He is 53 years old and has spent 30 of those years in the mountains. He knows things that Drummond cannot yet know. Things about how the light falls in winter in the high country, about what the sound of the wind in a particular kind of spruce tree means for the weather, about the way a well-lived life feels from the inside when you are old enough to assess it. He does not talk about these things often, but Drummond has learned over the years to pay attention when he does. Today, in the quiet of the afternoon, he talks about the country to the north, the Yellowstone region, where the geysers and hot springs and mud pots that John Coulter had described 20 years earlier still drew curious trappers who came back with stories that no one in the settlements could quite believe. Michel has been there twice, and he describes it in the slow, measured way of someone who knows that the truth is strange enough without embellishment. The water shooting from the ground in columns of steam and spray, the smell of sulfur that hung over certain areas like a permanent cloud, the colors of the mineral deposits around the hot springs, deep orange and red and white and yellow, the colors of a painting that seemed too vivid to be real. Drummond listens, and the afternoon passes gently, the sun moving across the sky. Above the valley walls, the sounds of the rendezvous distant and comfortable in the background. Let that afternoon rest settle around you now. The coffee is warm. The fire is small. The mountains are there as they always are, steady and beautiful and immense. By evening on Tuesday, the rendezvous has found its social rhythm. The trading is done for the day. The competitions have wound down. The serious business of the gathering, the formal exchange of furs and goods, is largely complete for most of the participants, and what remains is the pleasure of company. The fires around the camp are larger now, feeding the social need of people who have spent months largely alone. They gather around them in groups of 10, 20, 30, mountain men and indigenous traders and the company employees and the occasional traveler who has attached himself to the supply caravan for the experience of seeing the rendezvous. At White, a fire near the center of the mountain men's camp, a fiddle player has been playing since before the sun went down. His name is Jules Langlois, and he is a French-Canadian trapper who has been at the mountains for 8 years, and who would, Drummond suspects, have been a professional musician in a different life. The fiddle he plays was made in Quebec before. Jules came west and has survived 5 years of mountain life in a case he made himself from a hollowed cottonwood log, sealed with pine tar. It has been repaired 3 times. The tailpiece replaced with a piece of elk antler, a crack in the body sealed with hide glue made from rabbit skin. And its tone has taken on the particular warmth of an instrument that has been played thousands of times in all conditions. Jules plays the music of the French-Canadian tradition. Jigs and reels, and the slow, melancholy ballads called chansons that the voyageur culture had carried west from the settlements of the St. Lawrence Valley. These tunes had been in circulation for a century and more, many of them brought from France in the 17th century and transformed by their time in the New World into something that was neither quite French nor quite anything else. They carried within them the particular emotional register of people who had left behind everything they knew and built a new life in a wild country. A mixture of nostalgia, toughness, humor, and a certain defiant joy. When Jules plays a reel, people dance. The dancing at Rendezvous was a famous and energetic business. Men who had been confined to their own company for months released the pent-up energy of isolation in the vigorous, uncomplicated pleasure of a good reel. They danced with each other when women weren't available, as many of them weren't. They danced with indigenous women who had come to the gathering. They danced alone when no partner was convenient. The point was not the partner, but the movement, the rhythm, the physical expression of being alive and well and in company. 2 hawks and several of his Shoshone companions have joined the group around Jules's fire, drawn by the music in the way. That music draws people across every cultural boundary. The Shoshone have their own musical tradition, songs of hunting and war and ceremony accompanied by drums and rattles and the human voice, and they listen to Jules's fiddle with the same attentive appreciation that Jules would have shown for a Shoshone ceremonial singer. After Jules plays for an hour, one of the Shoshone men, a young warrior named Broken Bow, who is at his first rendezvous, begins to sing quietly to himself beside the fire, a high nasal melody with a complex rhythmic pattern that bears no resemblance to any European music. Jules listens until he has the rhythmic pattern and then begins to pick out notes on his fiddle that complement but don't compete with the singing. It is not exactly a duet. The 2 musical traditions are too different for that. But it is a conversation, musical and courteous, between 2 traditions that would never have met in any other context. Drummond sits at the edge of the fire and listens, and the evening passes in music and warmth, and the stars come out above the valley one by one until there are too many to count. Let the music drift through your mind now, soft and far away. The fiddle and the singing voice, the crackle of the fire, the immense stillness of the mountains around the small, warm circle of light. Let it carry you a little further towards sleep. Wednesday at the rendezvous is, by long tradition, the day for horse trading, horse racing, and the general celebration of what was, in 1830, the most important animal in the Western world. The horse had arrived in North America in 2 waves. The original horses, genus Equus, closely related to modern horses, had evolved on the North American continent and spread to Eurasia before going extinct in North America at the end of the last Ice Age, approximately 10,000 years ago. For 10,000 years, North America had no horses. Then, in the 16th century, the Spanish brought horses from Europe, descendants of the North African Barb and the Andalusian, crossed with other Mediterranean breeds, and these horses escaped from Spanish settlements in the southwest and spread northward, carried by trade networks between indigenous nations, until by the early 18th century, the Plains peoples from Mexico to the Canadian border had adopted the horse and been transformed by it. The spread of the horse across the plains was extraordinarily rapid for a pre-industrial cultural change. The Comanche of the southern plains had horses by around 1700. The Crow had them by perhaps 1730, the Blackfoot by roughly 1750, the Shoshone somewhere in between. In the span of perhaps 2 generations, the entire culture of the plains and mountain peoples changed. People who had been semi-sedentary farmers or pedestrian hunters became mobile, equestrian, and capable of hunting bison on a scale that transformed their diet, their social organization, their warfare, and their art. The specific breed of horse that predominated in the mountain and plains world of 1830 was a product of this history. It was not a purebred anything. It was a product of centuries of natural selection in the wild and selective breeding by indigenous peoples. A mix of Spanish foundation stock with the adaptations that come from living free on the North American range. These horses were smaller than the European warm bloods that the mounted armies of the East preferred. Typically, 13 to 15 hands at the shoulder compared to 15 to 17 hands for an American or European cavalry horse. But they were extraordinarily tough, capable of surviving on grass alone without grain supplementation, sure-footed on mountain terrain that would defeat a larger horse, and possessed of an endurance that larger horses could not match. The finest horses in the mountain world, by the near-universal agreement of everyone who knew horses in this era, were those bred by the Nez Perce people of the Columbia Plateau. The Nez Perce had been practicing selective horse breeding for perhaps a century, culling inferior animals and breeding for specific traits, endurance, sure-footedness, good temperament, speed, with a consistency and sophistication that was without parallel in North America. The result was the breed we now call the Appaloosa, a horse with a distinctive spotted coat pattern, a sparse mane and tail, and a hardiness that was legendary. A Nez Perce Appaloosa at a rendezvous horse race was almost invariably the favorite. On Wednesday morning, the horse racing takes place on a stretch of valley floor that has been cleared of the worst obstacles by informal consensus, a quarter-mile straight away with a brush marker at each end. The races are informal, spontaneous, and utterly serious. Men who have not wagered anything all year produce from somewhere the means to bet on a horse race: beaver plues, powder and lead, knives, blankets, and in some cases the horses themselves. Drummond watches from the crowd rather than racing because his best horse, a sturdy brown gelding that he bought from a crow trader 2 years ago, is good for mountain travel but not built for speed. He watches with appreciation as a Shoshone man rides a grey-spotted horse that might or might not be Nez Perce. There are various opinions among the onlookers, to a decisive victory over the best of the American mountain men's horses, covering the quarter-mile in a time that draws a collective sound from the crowd halfway between a groan and a shout. Let the horses run in your mind now. The drumming of hooves on the valley floor, the shouts of the crowd, the pure kinetic pleasure of a fast horse in flat country. Then let them slow. Let them walk. Let them graze peacefully in the afternoon meadow, their tails swishing in the summer air. Wednesday morning, before the horse racing begins, Drummond and Gaston walk up the slope east of the camp to a low ridge that gives a view across the entire valley, the spreading tents and tipis, the river winding through the middle, the mountains on all sides, and beyond the mountains, the suggestion of the Great Basin country to the south and west. From this vantage point, the valley looks exactly like what it is, a piece of ecological perfection. The combination of altitude, soil, moisture, and the particular angle of the summer sun has produced in this valley a concentration of biological richness that is visible even from a distance. The grass is thicker and greener along the river. The stands of cottonwood and willow that line the banks are dense and tall. Further up the slopes, the transition from grassland to sagebrush to pine forest to alpine meadow to bare rock is visible as a sequence of distinct bands of color and texture, each one representing a different community of plants and animals adapted to its particular set of conditions. This zone-by-zone stratification of life on a mountainside is one of the great patterns of ecology, and the Rocky Mountains display it more clearly than almost any other mountain range on Earth because the range is so tall and the transitions are so dramatic. At the valley floor, the conditions are equivalent to those of the upper plains. Short summer, cold winter, enough moisture for good grassland. 1,000 feet up the slope, the conditions are cooler and wetter, supporting the ponderosa pine that Drummond can see on the middle slopes. Another 1,000 feet, and the lodgepole pine takes over, filling the fire-maintained forests of the middle elevations. Higher still, the Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir form the dark, dense stands of the high country, and above the tree line, above 11,000 feet or so, the alpine meadows and tundra and bare rock represent conditions where only the most specialized plants can survive. Each of these zones has its own community of animals as perfectly adapted to its conditions as the plants. The elk and mule deer of the valley floor, the pika and the marmot of the alpine talus, fat storing or hibernating against the 8-month winter of their elevation. The Clark's nutcracker working the high whitebark pine forests, hiding seeds in caches that it will return to months later with an accuracy of memory that rivals any human navigator. The mountain goat, not the impala relative of Africa, but the North American mountain goat, Oreamnos americanus, a stocky, white, philosophical-looking animal with hooves engineered for the most vertical terrain on the continent. The mountain goat's hooves are worth a moment of attention because they represent an engineering solution to a problem that has no obvious answer. The problem is, how do you stand on a rock face tilted at 80 degrees without sliding off? The mountain goat's solution involves a hoof that is divided into 2 independent toes, each of which can move independently to grip irregularities in the rock surface. The outer edge of each toe is hard, like a climbing shoe's rand, for gripping tiny ledges. The inner surface is soft and rubbery, like a climbing shoe's sole, for friction on smooth rock. The dew claws, vestigial rear, digits, function as brakes when the animal descends steep slopes. The whole package allows the mountain goat to stand on ledges 2 inches wide at 6,000 feet above the valley floor, with the relaxed confidence of an animal that has never in its evolutionary history needed to worry much about falling. Drummond and Gaston sit on the ridge for perhaps an hour, saying little. They are both men who have learned the particular pleasure of silence shared with someone you trust. And then they go back down the slope to the camp, and the day begins in Ai. Ernest, let the ridge be there in your mind. The whole valley spread out below, everything visible and comprehensible and beautiful. The mountains on all sides, each one a world of its own. The river, a line of light through the middle of it all. Rest here before the horses run. By Wednesday afternoon, the social distinctions within the rendezvous community have become clear to any careful observer. The most fundamental division was between the company men, the hired trappers who worked on salary for the Rocky Mountain Fur Company or its competitors, and the free trappers who operated independently. The free trappers occupied the top of the social hierarchy of the mountain man world, and they knew it. They were independent contractors, answerable to no employer, free to trap wherever they chose, and to sell their furs to whichever company offered the best price. In practice, this freedom was partly illusory. The supply caravan's monopoly on essential goods meant that the free trapper was dependent on the company in ways that the formal independence of his status didn't fully convey. But the independence was real enough in spirit, and the free trappers maintained it with a fierce, almost reflexive pride. The company men, by contrast, were employees. They received a fixed wage, typically between $200 and $400 per year, paid in goods rather than cash at the rendezvous, and in exchange they worked under the direction of the company's field partners, who told them where to trap, how to allocate the catch, and what to do with their time. They received their supplies from the company at lower prices than the free trappers, another advantage of their status, but they also bore less of the risk and received less of the reward in a good year. Between these two groups, a certain amount of mutual condescension flowed in both directions. The free trappers regarded the company men as partially bound, domesticated, lacking the full autonomy that defined the mountain man at his best. The company men sometimes thought of the free trappers as reckless individualists who would eventually get themselves killed by going into dangerous country without the safety net of an organized group. Both of these assessments had some truth in them. There was also a third category of men at the rendezvous who fit into neither the free trapper nor the company man classification. The indigenous men who participated in the mountain trade, some of whom were as skilled and experienced as any of the American or French-Canadian trappers, but who operated within the social structures of their own nations rather than those of the fur trade companies. These men, Shoshone, Crow, Flathead and others, often achieved trading outcomes that the free trappers envied because they had access to the full range of indigenous trading networks and could play the fur companies against the informal market in ways that the European-American trappers could not. Drummond is thinking about these distinctions Wednesday afternoon as he sits with Michel and watches the social landscape of the rendezvous. Michel, who occupies a particularly interesting position, his mixed Crow and French heritage gives him a foot in multiple worlds simultaneously, has strong opinions on the subject, expressed in the measured, slightly ironic way of someone who has observed human social behavior for a long time and found it consistently amusing. The free trapper, Michel says, is free the way the beaver is free. He goes where he likes, does what he likes, and one day he puts his foot in the wrong place, and that is the end of his freedom. Drummond considers this for a while. It seems like wisdom, though it also seems like it might be a joke. With Michel, it is often both at once. The afternoon is warm. The grass smells of summer and sun. The mountains are very still. Wednesday evening is when the rendezvous becomes, for a portion of its participants, considerably less pleasant than it has been. This is when the whiskey, which has been flowing steadily since the first day, but with some constraint, reaches the level at which constraint gives way. The economics of the whiskey trade at Rendezvous deserve a careful look because they illuminate something important about the power dynamics of the fur trade. The whiskey that arrived with the supply caravan was not, by any generous standard, good whiskey. It was typically a rough grain spirit, made from rye or corn, distilled in the minimum quality stills of rural Pennsylvania or Kentucky. that had been diluted with water at roughly a 2-to-1 ratio before being barreled for the journey. To this diluted spirit, the suppliers sometimes added tobacco, red pepper, or molasses to give it apparent potency and color. The price charged for this liquid at Rendezvous, $1 a pint, sometimes more at the height of the gathering when other sources had been exhausted, was not just inflated, but was in a different moral category from the inflation on other goods. Powder and traps and blankets were essential, and their high prices reflected genuine transportation costs. Whiskey was neither essential nor well made, and its high price reflected primarily the captive nature of the market. The trappers were far from any alternative. They were in a social environment that made drinking seem normative, and they had money in their accounts that needed somewhere to go. The effects of a great deal of mediocre whiskey on men who have been in near isolation for months and who have been under genuine physical and psychological stress are predictable and well documented in the contemporary accounts of Rendezvous. There is a progression. First, a general loosening, a rise in the volume of conversation and laughter, an expansion of goodwill that covers even old grudges. Then, as the evening progresses, the loosening becomes instability. Men become louder, more argumentative, more likely to take offense at small provocations, and less likely to exercise the judgment that keeps small provocations from becoming large ones. And eventually, for some, a descent into the messy, unpredictable business of drunkenness, with all its attendant risks. The violence that occurred at Rendezvous was not primarily the result of enmity between the mountain men. These were people who, for the most part, had chosen to live in each other's company through hardships that would have destroyed any community built on less than genuine mutual regard. It was primarily the result of the chemical effects of alcohol on men in a heightened emotional state, magnified by the particular combustibility of masculine pride in a culture that placed enormous value on demonstrated toughness. Drummond has 1 cup of the whiskey on Wednesday evening and declines another. He is not moralistic about it. He has been drunk at Rendezvous before, and the experience was not so terrible. But he has noticed over his years in the mountains that the men who came out ahead at the end of a rendezvous week, who left the gathering with credit remaining and clear memories of what they had traded and for what, were consistently the men who drank less. Michel has never drunk whiskey in Drummond's presence. He has never explained why, and Drummond has never asked. He sits at a fire with Gaston and Michel and 2 hawks and watches the evening proceed with the comfortable detachment of someone who has found the right distance from the spectacle. Close enough to enjoy the music and the laughter, far enough from the trouble. Let the evening fire be warm and contained. Let the sounds of the larger gathering be distant and soft, like music heard from another room. You are comfortable here, with good companions, in no hurry, going nowhere. Rest. Thursday morning is slow to start. The previous evening's storytelling ran late, and the camp is quieter than usual through the early hours. Drummond wakes at his usual time but lies still in his blankets for a while, listening to the particular sound of the rendezvous as it wakes, a sound that is different from any other kind of waking because it contains so many languages at once. Within 50 yards of where he lies, he can hear French being spoken, the particular French of the Canadian voyageur tradition, which has diverged from Parisian French over 2 centuries of American isolation into something that is neither quite French nor quite anything else. A dialect full of indigenous borrowings and English intrusions, and a rolling rhythm that marks the speaker as surely as a signature. He can hear English in 2 or 3 accents. The flat vowels of New England, the broader sounds of Pennsylvania and Virginia, the particular twang that is beginning to be recognized as specifically Western, the English of people who have been speaking a great deal of French and a little Shoshone for years, and whose native tongue has taken on traces of both. He can hear Shoshone from the direction of 2 Hawks' camp, and what he thinks is Crow from somewhere further west. This multilingualism was not incidental to the rendezvous. It was one of its defining features, and it reflected the genuinely international character of the fur trade world. The mountain man community in 1830 included people who had been born in France, in Quebec, in the British Isles, in the eastern states, in the Spanish territories of the Southwest, and in the indigenous nations of the plains and mountains, They communicated with each other through a mixture of the languages they shared, supplemented by plain sign language when necessary, and the result was a kind of linguistic ecology as rich and complex as the landscape they moved through. The French-Canadian voyageur culture had contributed not just language, but song to the mountain man world. The chansons of the voyageur tradition were work songs, primarily, songs timed to the pace of paddling, their rhythms designed to synchronize the strokes of 8 or 12 paddlers in a large canoe. The tempo was approximately 40 strokes per minute for a loaded canoe on flat water, faster in a tailwind, slower in a headwind or against a current. The songs at this tempo are brisk but not frantic, and they were designed to fill the hours of sustained physical labor with something that made the time pass differently. The best known of these songs, En roulant ma boule, Alouette, à la Claire Fontaine, Vive la Canadienne, had been in circulation for so long that no one knew their origins. Some had come from France in the 17th century. Some had been composed in the canoes and portages of the Canadian wilderness. Some had been adapted from indigenous melodies into the French language tradition. They were the common property of everyone who had ever paddled a canoe in the fur trade, which by 1830 meant men of a dozen different national backgrounds who had learned them as working songs and kept them as comfort songs, and the songs you sang when the day was long and the portage was steep and you needed something to lean against. Jules Langlois, the fiddle player, knows most of these songs. He plays them in the evenings, and the French Canadians in the company sing along. And sometimes men who are not French Canadians sing along too, knowing the melody, if not the words, because some songs cross every barrier. There was also a body of English language song that the American mountain men carried with them, the ballads and hymns and comic songs of the Scots-Irish frontier tradition that had been moving westward with the settlers for generations. These songs had come from Scotland and Ireland and England in the 17th and 18th centuries, traveled through the backcountry of Pennsylvania and Virginia and Kentucky, absorbed American experiences and idiom, and arrived in the Rocky Mountains as something recognizably old world in origin, but genuinely American in character. The ballads of this tradition dealt primarily with the themes that ballads have always dealt with: love and loss, courage and cowardice, the treachery of the powerful and the occasional triumph of the powerless. They were long. A typical ballad had 12 to 20 verses, and they were designed to be sung unaccompanied, a single voice carrying the narrative through all its complications. A good ballad singer could hold a campfire audience for 20 minutes on a single song. The hymns deserve separate mention because they reveal something important about the spiritual lives of these apparently rough men. Many mountain men had grown up in the Protestant evangelical traditions of the American frontier. The Baptist and Methodist revivals of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and the hymns of those traditions were as deeply ingrained as any other part of their formation. A man who had not attended a church service in 5 years might still know 50 hymns by heart and might sing them alone in the mountains on a winter evening, not from piety exactly, but from the comfort of familiar music, the sense of connection to a shared cultural memory, the way a known melody in a dark and unfamiliar place is its own form of company. Let the music drift through you now, all of it, the fiddle and the chanson and the ballad and the hymn, the languages layered over each other like harmonics in a complex chord. Let it dissolve slowly into the quiet of the morning. Thursday at the 1830, rendezvous is quieter than Wednesday. The aftermath of the previous evening's excess has left a portion of the camp subdued, and the pace of the day is gentler as a result. Drummond spends the morning with the company's factor, Robert Campbell, who, in addition to his commercial function, serves as a kind of postal service for the mountain men, carrying letters from the settlements and distributing them to the men who can read them or who have found someone to read them aloud. Drummond has a letter from his mother in Pennsylvania, written in her careful, slightly cramped hand on paper that has traveled 2 months and 1,000 miles to reach him. He sits by the river to read it, which takes him some time. She writes about the farm, about his brother's new wife, about the death of a neighbor he barely remembers, about the price of corn this year, and her opinion of the new president, Andrew Jackson, who she regards with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. That seems to Drummond reading it here in the Wind River Valley, entirely right. She asks when he is coming home. He does not know how to answer this question, so he doesn't, noting it in his mind for the reply he will write before the supply caravan departs. The letter disposes him toward reflection, and he finds himself thinking about the geography that separates him from his mother's farm. The 1,000 miles of plain and river that the supply caravan has crossed to bring him her words. The further 100 miles of mountain and canyon that he will cross to reach his fall trapping grounds. The geography of the American West in 1830 was still imperfectly understood. There were enormous blank spaces on the best available maps, and many of the features that were marked inaccurately based on second-hand accounts that had been garbled in transmission. The mountain men themselves were, collectively, the most accurate source of geographical knowledge about this region, and the information they carried in their heads represented decades of accumulated observation. The broad structure of the Rocky Mountain system had been understood since Lewis and Clark's expedition, but the detail, the location of specific passes, the navigability of specific rivers, the relationship between watersheds, was still being worked out through the experience of trappers like Drummond and Michel, who spent their lives in the mountains. One of the great geographical puzzles of the era, for instance, was the question of what happened to the rivers that drained the interior of the Great Basin, the high, arid plateau between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. It was clear that several major rivers flowed into this region from the east and north. What was not clear was whether they connected, somewhere in the interior, to a river that eventually reached the Pacific. The theoretical Northwest Passage, an interior water route connecting the Atlantic drainage to the Pacific, was still a live geographical hypothesis in 1830, though the mountain men who had traveled the Great Basin knew, from practical experience, that no such river existed. The rivers that entered the Great Basin simply disappeared into desert lakes and playas, going nowhere. The man who had done more than anyone else to establish this geographical truth was Jedediah Smith, whose 1826 and 1827 explorations of the Great Basin and the routes to California were perhaps the most important geographical discoveries in the history of the American West. Smith had been killed in 1831, just a year after this rendezvous, on the Santa Fe Trail by a Comanche war party at the age of 32. His geographical knowledge, much of it unrecorded, died with him. But at this rendezvous, Smith is still alive. He attended the 1830 gathering and is somewhere in the valley this week, though Drummond has not yet encountered him. He is 31 years old, slight and serious, still marked by the famous grizzly bear attack that tore his scalp from his skull in 1823 and that was sewn back into place by his companion James Kleiman in one of the most remarkable field surgical operations in frontier history. Let the geography settle into your mind like a map drawn in sand. The rivers and the mountains and the passes, the blank spaces and the slowly filling detail, the world being understood piece by piece through the work and suffering and observation of a few hundred extraordinary people. Let it drift. Let your mind relax. In the Shoshone camp, Thursday afternoon, Drummond watches Two Hawks' wife, a woman named Painted Wing, making pemmican with a focused efficiency that reminds him of the best craftspeople he has known. Pemmican is one of the most important foods in the entire history of the North American fur trade, and it deserves careful attention. The word comes from the Cree language, pimikan, and refers to a high-energy, shelf-stable food made from 3 ingredients: dried meat, rendered fat, and dried berries. In its simplest form, pemmican is nothing more than these 3 things combined. In its most refined form, it is one of the most calorie-dense and nutritionally complete portable foods ever devised by human beings. The meat used in Plains pemmican was typically bison, specifically the lean meat from the hindquarters, sliced, thin and dried over a slow fire or in the sun until it was completely desiccated and brittle. The drying process removed virtually all of the moisture from the meat, reducing it to perhaps 20% of its original weight. This dried meat was then pounded, traditionally between 2 flat stones, until it was reduced to a coarse powder, the muscle fibers broken down into a consistency similar to coarse sawdust. The fat was rendered from the bison's internal fat deposits, particularly the kidney fat, which was the richest and cleanest tasting, by slow heating until all the moisture had evaporated and only pure fat remained. This rendering process was important. Unrendered fat spoiled quickly, but properly rendered fat could remain edible for years, particularly in the cold mountain climate. The berries, typically Saskatoon berries, also called service berries, or dried chokecherries, were dried and added to the mixture for flavor, carbohydrates, and vitamin C. The mixture of pounded meat, rendered fat, and dried berries was then packed into rawhide bags and sealed with more fat, producing a dense, brownish-purple cake that could be carried for months without spoiling and that provided approximately 3,500 calories per pound, significantly more than any commercially available modern trail food. Painted Wing works through the afternoon with an ease that speaks of lifelong practice. Her hands move with the particular economy of someone whose body has internalized a complex process completely, doing the right thing at the right moment without consulting the conscious mind. She is perhaps 35 years old, compact, and quick, with the kind of focused energy that makes a small person seem to take up exactly the right amount of space. Two hawks sits nearby, working on the shaft of an arrow, and they talk to each other in Shoshone with the easy, companionable rhythm of two people who have been married for a long time and are comfortable in each other's presence. Drummond watches and listens, understanding nothing of the words but a great deal of the tone. When a portion of the pemmican is finished, enough to fill a small rawhide bag the size of a man's fist, Painted Wing hands it to Drummond with a brief nod. He bites into it and chews slowly. It is dense and rich, faintly sweet from the berries, deeply savory from the meat, with a smooth creaminess from the fat. It is not delicious in the way that fresh food is delicious, but it is deeply satisfying in the way that only truly nourishing food can be, the satisfaction of a body being given exactly what it needs. He thanks her through his limited Shoshone, supplemented by hand signs, and she acknowledges this with a small smile and goes back to her work. Let the afternoon be slow and warm. The smell of the pemmican and the fire and the summer grass. The sound of the river and the distant music from somewhere in the camp. Your body completely at rest, heavy and comfortable. The week turning toward its end. Thursday evening, around a large central fire where 2 or 3 dozen people have gathered. The stories come out, the great stories of the mountain man world, told and retold across the years until they have acquired something of the character of legend, though every person in the circle knows they are true. Drummond has heard most of these stories before, but he has also learned, in his 5 years in the mountains, that stories worth hearing are worth hearing more than once, that each telling reveals something the previous telling concealed, that the same story means different things when you are 23 and when you are 28. That the pleasure of a great story is not primarily the surprise of the narrative, but the craft of the telling. Tonight's storyteller is a man named Henry Frabe, one of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company's own partners, a German immigrant who came to America as a young man and to the mountains shortly after. He is not the most polished of storytellers, but he is honest and specific, and he was present for many of the events he describes, which gives his accounts a weight that more ornate telling could not match. He tells the story of Hugh Glass, which Drummond has heard perhaps a dozen times. The basic facts are as follows. In the autumn of 1823, Glass was traveling with a fur trapping party in the Black Hills region when he was attacked and mauled by a female grizzly bear that he had surprised. At close range, the bear crushed his skull partially, tore open his back and throat, and left him with wounds so severe that the men who found him expected him to be dead within hours. 2 men were left behind to wait with him, and when he died, to bury him. Instead, they took his equipment and his rifle, told the rest of the party he was dead, and departed. Glass, as everyone in the circle knows, did not die. He regained consciousness in what may have been a shallow grave, accounts vary on this detail, and crawled, then walked faster, across approximately 200 miles of hostile wilderness in approximately 6 weeks, eating what he could find, treating his own infected wounds by methods that included, according to multiple accounts, deliberately placing them in a rotting log to allow maggots to eat the necrotic flesh. he survived. He made his way to Fort Kiowa on the Missouri River. He then set out to find the two men who had left him. The details of what happened when he found them, Jim Bridger, who was young and apparently remorseful, and John Fitzgerald, who had enlisted in the US Army, are part of the story's famous conclusion. Glass spared Bridger because of his youth and apparent guilt, and was persuaded to forgo his revenge on Fitzgerald by the practical argument that killing a soldier would bring the US Army into a situation that nobody wanted. What Frabe emphasizes, telling the story tonight is not the drama of the survival or the resolution of the revenge narrative, but the psychological dimension, the sheer, bloody-minded determination that kept Glass moving across 200 miles of winter wilderness, when most people in his condition would have given up and died. He was not a man who accepted what was given to him, Frabe says in his careful, accented English. Not even death. The circle is quiet for a moment after the story ends. Then someone asks about Coulter, John Coulter's run from the Blackfoot, the other great story of mountain man endurance and survival, and Frabe tells that one too, and then someone else tells another, and the evening passes in stories. Let the stories drift through your mind, soft as smoke, images forming and dissolving. The wide plain, the running man, the cold river, the long crawl through the wilderness. These things happened. These people were real. And then let them go, let them dissolve back into the past, and let the fire warm you in the present and let your eyes close. After the stories end and the fire burns low, Drummond lies on his back, in the grass outside his camp, and looks up at the sky for a long time before sleeping. It is one of his habits, a way of ending the day that he developed in his first winter alone in the mountains, when the sky was the only thing large enough to contain the loneliness, and that he has kept ever since. The sky over the Wind River Valley on a clear July night in 1830 is one of the great spectacles of the natural world. There is no artificial light for hundreds of miles in any direction. The Milky Way, the disk of the galaxy seen edge on from within, stretches from horizon to horizon in a band of light so dense and complex that it takes the eyes a few minutes to fully adjust to it, to begin to resolve the general brightness into individual stars and clusters and the dark lanes of dust that cut through it. The number of stars visible to the naked eye in a truly dark sky is approximately 5,000. In a moderately light-polluted location, a modern suburban area, perhaps 200 stars are visible. In a city, perhaps 20. The difference between 20 stars and 5,000 stars is not merely quantitative but qualitative. It changes the character of the sky entirely, from a backdrop of scattered lights to a structure, a presence, a thing with depth and complexity that rewards attention for as long as you are willing to give it. What Drummond can see, lying on his back in the grass, includes several things that would have been identified by any educated person of his era. Jupiter is visible in the west, bright and steady. Planets do not twinkle as stars do because they are close enough to present a small disk rather than a point source, and the atmospheric turbulence that makes stars twinkle averages out across that disk. Saturn is fainter and further east, its presence requiring some attention to confirm. Mars has set already. The constellation Scorpius is prominent in the south, a great curving line of bright stars that the Greeks saw as a scorpion, and that the Shoshone had their own name and story for, as did the Lakota and the Crow and every other people who had looked up at this sky for generations beyond counting. The heart of the Scorpion is a brilliant red star called Antares, from the Greek, meaning rival of Ares or rival of Mars, which is a supergiant star so large that if it occupied the position of our own sun, it would extend beyond the orbit of Jupiter. It sits at approximately 550 light-years from the Wind River Valley, meaning the light entering Drummond's eyes left that star around the year 1280, roughly 5.5 centuries before this July night. These are facts that Drummond does not know. He knows the star as a reddish bright point in the south, one of the reliable markers by which he navigates. Its antiquity and its scale are beyond the conceptual reach of any person living in 1830. The tools for measuring stellar distances were just being developed by astronomers in Europe, and the distances they were finding were so large that the numbers seemed almost meaningless. But the wonder is real, regardless of its explanation. Drummond has looked at this sky hundreds of times in his years in the mountains, and it still does what it always does. It makes the problems of the human scale feel manageable, puts them in a proportion that seems right. The accounting books of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, the price of powder, the politics of the eastern settlements, even the hardship and danger of the mountain life, all of it seems, under this sky, exactly as large as it deserves to be, and no larger. He is asleep before he means to be. The stars still moving their slow arc overhead, the river below murmuring its unchanged and unchangeable song. Let the stars be there for you now. The Milky Way and its 5,000 points of light, the planets steady in the west, the great scorpion curving across the south. Let the scale of it be restful rather than overwhelming, the way the truly large things, when you really look at them, have a quality of peace about them that the merely large things do not. Let yourself be small under that enormous sky, and let small feel right. Let sleep come. Friday morning, Drummond helps carry a wounded man to the rough infirmary that has been set up in one of the larger tents near the supply depot. The wound is not life-threatening. A knife cut along the forearm incurred during an argument the previous evening that had escalated faster than it should have, but it is deep enough to require stitching, and the man, a young American, named Peters, who is at his first rendezvous, is frightened. The person doing the stitching is not a formally trained physician. There is no formally trained physician within 1,000 miles, but a French-Canadian trapper named Arnaud, who has a reputation throughout the mountain man community for competence in field medicine. He learned what he knows from a combination of sources. A French surgeon in Montreal who treated him for a broken leg at the age of 16 and who allowed him to watch the process. Years of experience treating his own wounds and those of his companions, and the considerable body of knowledge that he has absorbed from the indigenous healers with whom he has lived and worked over 20 years in the mountains. The frontier medical world of 1830 is not the world of ignorance and superstition that it is sometimes portrayed as. The men and women who practiced medicine on the frontier, whether in the formal capacity of trained physicians or in the informal capacity of experienced practitioners like Arnaud, were operating with some genuine knowledge and some genuine skill. Even if they lacked the germ theory of disease, the antiseptics, and the anesthetics that would transform medicine later in the 19th century. Let the fire be warm. Let the music be real. Let the stars be there, each one a sun at a distance so enormous that the number of years its light has traveled to reach this valley is larger than any number that means anything to the human mind. Let all of that be true at once, and let it be restful, as the truly immense and beautiful things are always, finally, restful. In the late hours of Friday night, when the fire has burned to coals and most of the camp is asleep, Drummond sits, awake for a little while, not from anxiety but from the pleasant, expansive wakefulness that sometimes comes on the best nights, when the mind wants more time with the thoughts it is carrying. He is thinking about the bison. He has been in bison country for 5 years, and the animals still astonish him. Not any individual bison, the individual animals, seen close, are often unpredictable and sometimes dangerous, but they are not particularly remarkable to look at. What astonishes Drummond is the bison as a phenomenon. The herds, the numbers, the sheer biological mass of animals moving across the plain. In 1830, the American bison, exists in numbers that are genuinely difficult for the human mind to comprehend. The best estimates for the pre-settlement bison population of North America range from 30 million to 60 million animals. 60 million animals, each weighing between 800 and 2,000 pounds. The total biomass of the North. American bison herd in 1830 may have been greater than the total biomass of all domesticated cattle in the world at that time. These animals had been on the continent for approximately 10,000 years in their current form, having arrived from Asia via the land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska before the sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. They replaced several even larger relatives, the giant bison, Bison latifrons, with its horn span of nearly 7 feet, that went extinct as the ice retreated and the climate changed. The modern bison found the grasslands of the American interior perfectly suited to its requirements and expanded to fill them with a thoroughness that would have seemed like permanence to anyone observing the landscape in 1830. The plains that the bison inhabited were, in a very real sense, shaped by the bison. The grasses of the Great Plains had co-evolved with the bison over millions of years, developing the deep root systems and basal growth habits that allowed them to withstand heavy grazing, and the bison's grazing, wallowing, and trampling maintained the prairie in a condition of maximum productivity. Remove the bison and the prairie changed, became overgrown in some places, eroded in others, invaded by shrubs and trees in the absence of the grazing pressure that kept the grasses dominant. Relationship between the plains peoples and the bison was correspondingly complex and intimate. The Shoshone, the Lakota, the Crow, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, all of the plains and mountain nations had developed their cultures around the bison in ways that went far beyond mere food dependency. The bison provided not just food, but shelter. The hides for tipis and robes, clothing, the tanned hides for garments, tools, the bones for scrapers and needles, the horns for spoons and cups, the sinew for bowstrings and thread, fuel, the dried dung, called buffalo chips, which burned with a slow, hot, nearly smokeless flame in the treeless plains, and a spiritual dimension that was woven through the ceremonies and worldviews of every plains nation. The bison hunt itself was elevated in the plains cultures to an art form of considerable sophistication. The individual mounted hunt, a hunter on a trained horse, galloping alongside a running bison at full speed, shooting with bow or firearm from a distance of 10 feet or less, required years of practice and a partnership with the horse that was as carefully developed as any human relationship. The horse had to be trained to run alongside a bison without flinching, to respond to the rider's knee pressure alone, since both hands were needed for the weapon, to adjust its speed to maintain the exact position relative to the bison that gave. The hunter, the best shot angle. The best hunting horses were as valuable as any material possession in the plains world. A horse that had been trained for bison hunting, that was fast and calm and responsive, that could chase a stampeding herd without losing its nerve, such a horse was worth more than any number of trade goods, and losing one to theft or accident was a serious blow to a hunter's livelihood. Drummond knows all of this, has seen it, has participated in group hunts with Crow and Shoshone companions who showed him, with patient generosity, how it was done. He thinks about the bison as he sits by the dying fire. And then he thinks about what the mountain men who have been in the trade longest say, that the numbers are still enormous, still seemingly inexhaustible, but that in certain areas that 10 years ago were thick with bison, the herds are now less reliable, moving differently, responding to the increasing pressure of hunting by ranging further and wider than they used to. He does not know what this means for the long term. No one in 1830 does. The idea that the American bison could be hunted to the edge of extinction, that would happen by the 1880s, with fewer than 1,000 animals remaining, is as unimaginable to Drummond as the idea that the stars could be counted and found to number only so many. The fire goes entirely cold. Drummond wraps his blanket more tightly and closes his eyes, and the last thing he thinks before sleep takes him is the image of a bison herd on the open plain. The dark, moving mass of it, the sound like distant thunder, the smell of 10,000 large animals moving together across the grass. Let that image carry you. The great herd moving, the plain stretching to the horizon, the sky above it enormous and blue, and then slowly let the image dissolve into darkness, into the warm, patient darkness of deep sleep. Saturday at the rendezvous is a day of packing and departure. The supply caravan's men begin loading the fur bales early in the morning, working efficiently to compress months of labor into organized stacks of pressed and baled pelts that will travel downstream to St. Louis and then to the eastern markets. The sound of the fur press, the great wooden screw press that compresses loose furs into the dense, manageable bales that the market requires, punctuates the morning like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. Drummond packs his own camp with the same efficiency he brings to everything in the mountains, the experienced traveler's knowledge that everything must have a place and a purpose, that anything carried that doesn't earn its weight is a burden and not a possession. His worldly goods, distributed among the 9 pack animals, amount to perhaps 300 pounds. His rifle and ammunition, his traps, his bedroll, his cooking kit, his remaining food, the goods he has acquired at rendezvous, and the small, leather bag in which he carries the things that don't fit any other category. A small Bible given to him by his mother. A piece of obsidian that he picked up near the Yellowstone country for reasons he can't fully articulate. A lock of hair in a folded piece of paper that came from someone he doesn't talk about. The goodbyes at Rendezvous are not the extended, emotional farewells of the settled world. They are brief, direct, and carry a weight that is unspoken but understood by everyone. Some of the men saying goodbye this Saturday will not be alive to say hello next July. The mountains take people. The Blackfoot and the Arikara and the Comanche take people. The rivers take people. The winter takes people. The grizzly bears take people. Everyone at the rendezvous knows this, and the particular quality of the Saturday goodbyes reflects it. A handshake that lasts a beat too long, an eye contact held a moment past the usual social duration, a few words that mean something different from what they literally say. Drummond says goodbye to Two Hawks through the usual combination of Shoshone and sign language. Two Hawks gives him a small gift, a piece of dried meat wrapped in a strip of willow bark, and says something that Michelle, standing beside Drummond, translates as approximately, "Come back, the valley will be here." He says goodbye to Jules, Langlois, who is heading south toward the Taos country for the winter and who will probably be at next year's rendezvous unless he isn't. He says goodbye to Robert Campbell, the factor, whose handshake is firm and whose ledger entries are impeccably accurate. He says goodbye to various other men, whose names he will remember for years and whose faces he can already feel beginning to blur, because there are too many faces in a life lived among a large community, and the memory can't hold all of them at full resolution. And then he says goodbye to Michelle, which is the goodbye that matters most. Michelle is not going with Drummond this fall. He is heading north toward the Yellowstone country with a different group. Old friends, men he has trapped with for decades. It is the first time in 3 years that Drummond and Michelle will not spend the fall trapping season together, and the significance of this is not lost on either of them. Michelle gives Drummond a look, one of those looks that contains a complete speech, and says in French something that translates roughly as, "You know enough now." Wound care was one area where the frontier practitioners often did quite well, precisely because the indigenous medical traditions that many of them had learned from had accumulated over generations a pragmatic understanding of wound management that did not depend on theoretical knowledge but worked nonetheless. The principle of keeping wounds clean, not in the modern bacteriological sense, but in the practical sense of removing foreign material and dead tissue, was widely understood. The use of certain plant materials with genuine antiseptic or healing properties was common. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, was the most widely used of these. It grew abundantly throughout the Rocky Mountain region and was known to both indigenous and European American practitioners as a wound herb of the first order. Modern analysis has confirmed that yarrow contains several compounds with genuine pharmacological activity: achillin and achillikin, which reduce inflammation, flavonoids with mild antiseptic properties, and compounds that promote blood clotting. A yarrow poultice applied to a fresh wound was not merely traditional medicine, it was effective medicine. Arnaud uses yarrow on Peters's wound after washing it thoroughly with clean river water and probing it with a finger to determine its depth and the condition of the underlying tissue. He then stitches it with a curved needle and heavy thread, ideally sinew, which is stronger than any commercially available thread, but thread from the company's supplies will do. The stitching is done without anesthesia, which means Peters has to hold still through a discomfort that is real and significant, and which he manages with the determinedly stoic expression of someone who is doing the best they can. The whole procedure takes perhaps 20 minutes. Arnaud binds the wound with a strip of clean cotton cloth, instructs Peters on the care of the stitches. Keep it clean, keep it covered, don't flex the arm more than necessary, and accepts the thanks of Peters and the small payment of a plug of tobacco that Peters produces from his kit with the earnest gratitude of someone who knows he has received competent care. Drummond watches and thinks, not for the first time, that the skills required to live well in the wilderness were broader and stranger than he had anticipated when he first came west. You had to be a carpenter and a hunter and a geographer and a diplomat, and, it turned out, sometimes a surgeon. The mountain offered no specialization. It demanded everything from everyone. Let that thought settle gently. The wound is clean. The stitching is done. The morning is moving past its midpoint, and the valley is warm in the Friday sun. Rest. Friday afternoon, with the week approaching its end, and the rendezvous beginning to show its signs of winding down. Fewer new trades being made, more conversations about departure plans, a general settling and consolidation. Drummond takes some time to simply walk. He walks north along the river, away from the camp, until the sounds of the rendezvous are distant and the valley returns to something of its natural character. The river beside him is clear and cold, its bottom visible at a depth of 4 feet. The particular clarity of mountain water that has been filtered through miles of gravel and snowfield. Small cutthroat trout hold in the currents behind boulders, visible as shadows from above, vanishing in a flash of silver when Drummond's shadow falls across the water. The cutthroat trout, Oncorhynchus clarkii, gets its name from the distinctive red or orange slashes on the underside of its jaw, which look to a certain imaginative eye like the marks of a blade. It is the native trout of the Rocky Mountain West, having evolved in isolation in the mountain river systems after the glaciers of the last ice age retreated, and it was abundantly present in the Wind River and its tributaries in 1830. The mountain. Men ate trout when they could catch them, and they could nearly always catch them, since the fish were naive enough about human predators to be readily caught by anyone with a bent pin and a piece of dried meat. Further from the river, the valley floor is alive in ways that reward attention. The meadow grass is full of grasshoppers, thousands of them, the large, yellow-winged kind that makes a rattling, clattering sound in flight. These grasshoppers were an important food source for the valley's birds. Long-billed curlews probed the grass on their extraordinary curved bills. Meadowlarks sang from every prominent stone, and a pair of Swainson's hawks soared overhead, watching the grasshopper-rich meadow below with the patient efficiency of creatures whose entire existence depended on accurate assessment of what was edible and where it was. The Swainson's hawk, Buteo swainsoni, is one of the great long-distance migrants of the bird world. This pair, hunting the Rendezvous Valley in July, has flown from their wintering grounds in the Argentine Pampas, a journey of approximately 6,000 miles each way, made twice a year. Their route takes them up through Central America and along the Great Plains, and then back again in September. The individual birds that Drummond watches overhead in 1830 may be the same birds that Hawks watchers in Buenos Aires see in their winters. The world, in this sense, has always been more connected than it seems from any single vantage point. The wildflowers in the meadow are at their summer peak. Drummond, who was taught the names of the meadow plants he knew in Pennsylvania by his mother, and has extended that knowledge cautiously in the mountain environment, can identify some of them. The brilliant Indian paintbrush, its bracts so intensely scarlet that it looks almost artificial. The purple spikes of loco weed, beautiful and dangerous, lethal to horses that eat it in quantity. The white of yarrow spreading in flat-topped clusters throughout the drier sections of the meadow. The deep blue of lupine in the moister hollows, near the river. He walks for perhaps 2 miles, and then turns and walks back, and the sounds of the rendezvous come gradually back to him. The voices, the horses, the fire smoke. He enters the camp again with the particular quality of attention that a walk in natural country gives to the things you return to. They seem more vivid, more human, more alive. Let the meadow be in your mind now. The grasshoppers rattling in, the grass. The hawks turning in the blue sky above. The cold river running beside you, clear as glass, the trout shadows wavering in the current. Let the whole valley exist in your mind at once, perfect and still, and then let it dissolve slowly, gently, into the darkness of rest. Friday evening is, by common agreement among the mountain men who attend these gatherings, the best night of the rendezvous week. The serious business of the first days is done. The worst of the whiskey-fueled trouble has settled. The departure that comes with Saturday and Sunday is still far enough away that the prospect of solitude has not yet colored the evening with sadness. It is simply a very good night. Warm, full of good company, with music and stories and the particular warmth of a community that has reformed itself after a year apart and is savoring the fact of being together before it disperses again. Jules. Langlois plays his fiddle from sundown until past midnight, and at some point he is joined by a Shoshone man who plays a small hand drum and a younger mountain man from Virginia who has a harmonica, a relatively new instrument in 1830, the harmonica having been invented in Germany in the 1820s and spreading to America with remarkable speed. The three instruments find a common rhythm with the easy naturalness of musicians who are all, at their cores, playing for the pleasure of it. And the music that emerges is unlike anything that has ever been or will ever be heard again, a music of that particular time and place and mixture of traditions that no one thought to write down or record. Two Hawks dances with his wife Painted Wing in the Shoshone tradition, a quiet, dignified movement quite different from the vigorous reels of the mountain men, but equally rooted in pleasure and community. Several of the French-Canadian engagés from the company camp have joined the fire, and they dance with each other and with anyone willing in the boisterous, acrobatic style of the voyageur tradition. Drummond sits at the edge of the fire with Michel and Gaston and watches, and the feeling he has, which he would not call happiness exactly because that word seems too simple, is something more complex. A sense of being exactly where he is supposed to be, of the world being right-sized and comprehensible, of time moving at exactly the correct pace. He will leave the mountains eventually. He knows this. 5 years in, he can already see the way. The life works over the longer arc. The gradual attrition of the beaver, the shifting economics, the aging of the body. Michel, at 53, is still fully capable in the mountains, but there are visible costs. A knee that troubles him in cold weather, a hearing loss in one ear from a rifle fired too close on a windless day, a reserve of energy that is smaller than it used to be and has to be husbanded more carefully. Drummond will face these things too in time, but that is later. Right now, the fire is warm and the music is playing and his companions are beside him, and the mountains, the extraordinary, improbable, beautiful mountains, are rising in the darkness all around the valley, and the stars above them are more than he can count. Drummond holds this for a moment. Then he nods. It feels like both a statement and a question, and he is not entirely sure which part of it he is nodding to. They shake hands, and Michel turns and walks away through the camp, and Drummond watches him go, and then turns himself and begins to lead his horses toward the valley's eastern end. Let the goodbye be soft in your mind, not sad, or not only sad. The kind of goodbye that contains within it the genuine hope of return, the knowledge that the parting is not permanent. The valley will be here. Come back. The last morning of the rendezvous week is Sunday, the 18th of July. The valley is transformed from what it was a week ago. The central supply camp has been packed, and the caravan is already moving east, its long line of loaded pack mules and horses diminishing down the valley floor in the morning light. The large central fires have been extinguished, their sites marked by rings of grey ash in the flattened grass. The various mountain men's camps have been cleared, their occupants dispersed into the mountains in a dozen different directions. Fusai's Shoshone camp is largely gone. Two Hawks and his people departed quietly before dawn, in the traditional manner of people who have long experience moving through a landscape and who see no reason to make more noise about it than necessary. What remains is the evidence of occupation, the flattened grass, the fire rings, the occasional abandoned item, a broken knife, a worn-out moccasin, an empty tin that once held coffee, that was too worn to carry and too small to worry about. In a few weeks, the grass will have recovered, and most of these traces will be absorbed or blown away, and the valley will look very much as it did before the gathering came. Drummond pauses at the edge of the now empty camp and looks back at the valley. The morning is cold and clear, the frost on the grass catching the early sun in thousands of small, brilliant points of light. The Wind River glitters between the cottonwoods. The mountains rise on all sides, their glaciers and snowfields white against the deep blue sky. He has been coming to this valley for 5 years. He knows it in the particular way that you know a place that holds important memories, Not just its geography, but its feeling, its character, the quality of its light, at different times of day. This valley is where he became, over 5 rendezvous, the person he is now. Someone who can read a landscape and navigate by stars and track an animal across rock and jury rig, almost anything from whatever is at hand. Someone who has been cold enough that cold no longer frightens him. Someone who has been hungry enough that food tastes different than it used to. Someone who has been alone in the mountains long enough to know, with certainty, that he is not afraid of solitude. He does not know yet whether he will be here next July. The beaver are thinning, not catastrophically, not yet, but perceptibly. The economics are shifting. There is talk that the hat fashion is changing in Europe, that silk is replacing felt. The world does not hold still for the mountain men any more than it holds still for anyone else. But that is the future. Right now, there is the valley, and the mountains, and the river, and the long, beautiful ride ahead of him through the high country toward his fall trapping grounds. He touches his horse lightly with his heels, and they move forward together, and the valley falls slowly behind him as he rides. And now let the valley fall behind us too. Let the mountains recede into the distance, their snowfields becoming smaller and then gone, the river narrowing to a line of silver and then disappearing into the landscape. Let the sounds of the rendezvous, the music and the voices and the horses and the river, dissolve into silence, into the soft, full silence of a summer night in the mountains. You have been there. You have walked through the week of the 1830 rendezvous day by day, the arrival Sunday when the valley filled with people from every direction, the commercial Monday with its fur grading and its accounting, the informal Tuesday market with its moccasins and its coffee and its complex person-to-person economy, the horses of Wednesday and the music and the firelight of Wednesday evening, the reflective Thursday with its geography and its pemmican, the stories of Thursday night, the great stories of Glass and Coulter, the Friday medicine and the Friday walk and the Friday evening that was the best of the week, the packing and the goodbyes of Saturday, and this last, still Sunday morning, with the valley returning to itself and the mountains standing as they always stand, before and after every human thing. The facts are in you now, or drifting through you. The Hawken rifle and its self-sharpening, chisel incisors of steel. The Hudson's Bay point blanket and the Oxfordshire mills that made it. The made beaver currency and the $2 pound of powder. The free trappers and their tightly held independence. The Shoshone and their extraordinary horsemanship. The pemmican and its 3,500 calories per pound. The cutthroat trout in the clear, cold river. The Swainson's hawk heading, back to Argentina in September. The grasses and the wildflowers and the cottonwood gold of autumn yet to come. All of these things were real. Every detail was true. The valley was there. The people were alive. They woke in the cold mornings and built their fires and ate their porridge and traded their furs and told their stories and said their goodbyes and rode out through the mountains into whatever came next. And now it is late, and you are very nearly asleep. Your breathing is slow and deep. Your body is warm and heavy. The world outside is doing exactly what it is supposed to do, and you are doing exactly what you are supposed to do, which is rest. The rendezvous is over. The valley is empty again. The river runs in the darkness, cold and clear and patient. The mountains are there in the long dark as they always are. Sleep now. Rest deeply. The week has been long and full and good. Good night.